I ran outside. My fence was gone. Instead, Karen stood there smugly, watching as workers tore my land apart piece by piece. "This is my property, Mike," she smirked. I had no idea yet that her greed would turn against her. I had been living in this house for 5 years. Small but cozy, my yard was my pride and joy. Every morning, I would step onto the terrace with a cup of coffee, breathe in the fresh air, and admire my well-kept lawn, neatly arranged flower beds, and the sturdy wooden fence that separated my property from my neighbors. I was as certain about the boundaries of my land as I was about the sky being blue. But that morning, something went terribly wrong. A sharp metallic screech followed by a dull thud made me flinch. What the hell? I set my cup down on the table and quickly walked to the window. What I saw made my heart skip a beat. Karen, my neighbor. She stood there with a smug expression, arms crossed over her chest, watching as a group of workers in yellow vests tore down my fence. One of them had already ripped out a section and tossed it to the ground, while another had armed himself with a crowbar and was prying the wooden posts out of the earth. I rushed to the door, unable to believe my eyes. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted as I ran outside. The workers didn't even pause. They carried on as if I were invisible. One of them, without looking up, threw a response over his shoulder. "We were told to remove this fence. It's on someone else's property." I froze. Someone else's property? What the hell do they mean, someone else's property? This fence had been standing here for decades. I spun around to face Karen. "Are you out of your mind? That's my fence, Karen. Why the hell are you tearing it down?" She turned to me slowly, her face a mask of utter indifference. "It's my land, Mike," she said, looking me up and down. "I checked the records and found that your fence is on my property, so I'm removing it." I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't even anger, at least not yet, just pure, icy shock. I immediately called the police. I didn't care that half of my fence had already been torn down. I wasn't about to let Karen take my land without a fight. 20 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the driveway. A tall officer with a tired face stepped out. Someone who, judging by his expression, had already decided he didn't want to deal with this mess. "Finally," I exhaled, rushing toward him. "These people are tearing down my fence without permission. I jabbed a finger at Karen, who stood nearby with her arms crossed. "Thinks she can just take my land." The officer lazily glanced around the yard before looking at Karen. "Ma'am, is this true?" Karen nodded and, without a shred of shame, declared, "Of course. I have documents. His fence was on my land, so I'm just restoring justice." I nearly choked on my own rage. "What damn documents?" I snapped. "Where's a single piece of proof that says that?" The officer just let out a weary sigh. "Listen, sir, this is a civil matter. You need to take it to court." I froze. "You're joking, right? They just tore down my fence. How the hell is no one doing anything?" "Take it to court," he repeated with a shrug. And that was it. The police left, leaving me alone with a smug Karen who was practically glowing with satisfaction. "Well, Mike," she smirked, tilting her head. "Figure it out. But in the meantime, this will be my new garden." I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. She wasn't even trying to hide her arrogance. A few days later, where my fence had once stood, Karen planted a flower bed. She stole part of my land, got away with it, didn't even bat an eye. And me? I could do nothing. I started digging through my documents, only to find that my records were incomplete. Somehow, part of the paperwork containing the official property plan had gone missing, and the rest wasn't convincing enough. I had nothing to counter her so-called proof. Meanwhile, Karen was having the time of her life. She strolled around the neighborhood, smiling as she told everyone, "Well, Mike only has himself to blame. He's been occupying someone else's land for years. Good thing I got it all sorted out." The neighbors looked at me with sympathy, but no one intervened. I was becoming the villain of the story in their eyes, and that infuriated me even more. I was shaking with rage, but I wasn't going to give up. I was angry, but I wasn't stupid. Karen wanted to beat me legally? Fine. I'd play by her rules. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer, Stephen Grace, a specialist in land disputes, a man whose face practically screamed, "I'm going to win this case." He carefully examined the documents and immediately suggested conducting a professional boundary survey. "Let's find out who's actually right here," he said with a slight smirk as he opened his laptop. The specialists arrived a few days later, working with professional equipment to compare the actual property boundaries with cadastral records. A couple of days later, the results came in. I braced myself, expecting to hear something like, "Karen was actually right," but instead, "The property line isn't exactly where you thought," Stephen said, flipping through the report. "But here's the real problem." He turned his screen toward me. Karen hadn't just taken my fence. When she re-registered her property, she expanded it, illegally claiming a portion of municipal land. "Her new garden is illegal," my lawyer continued, tapping his finger on the diagram. "She didn't just tear down your fence. She stole land from the city." I felt a quiet, predatory satisfaction ignite within me. Karen had been so consumed by her own greed that she had walked straight into a trap, one she set for herself. I immediately filed a complaint with the local administration, not as a request, but as an official report of illegal land seizure. Now Karen was playing on my turf. A few days later, my lawyer called me. "It's shaping up even better than we expected, Mike," he said. "The municipal authorities have already taken up the case. She didn't just grab land illegally. Now she's facing fines and potential lawsuits." I closed my eyes and exhaled deeply. This moment was worth all the sleepless nights and wasted nerves. Now all that was left was to wait for justice to be served. A month passed. I had been waiting for the moment Karen would realize her game was over, but I never expected it to be this sweet. That morning my phone rang. My lawyer. "She got the notice." I smiled. Karen wasn't just ordered to remove her precious garden. She had to pay a fine for illegally seizing municipal land. The authorities didn't just ask her to vacate the area. They handed her a bill, a hefty one, but the best part was yet to come. My lawyer didn't just prove that Karen had unlawfully torn down my fence. He made sure she was the one who had to restore it, at her own expense. I knew she was furious. She tried to fight the ruling, filed complaints, called the administration, even threatened to pull some strings. But nothing worked. Everything was legal, flawless. And so, there I stood, coffee cup warm in my hands, watching the most satisfying spectacle of my life. The very workers she had hired were now silently putting my fence back up. The same fence she had so proudly destroyed. Her beautiful flower bed was turning back into empty grass. Karen stood nearby, lips pressed into a thin line. Her arms were crossed, fingers clenched into fists, her gaze heavy with frustration, but she couldn't do a thing about it. When the last wooden post was secured, I stepped out onto my porch. Our eyes met. I lifted my coffee and took a slow sip. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I said, nodding toward the fence. "Just like it was before." Karen gritted her teeth, spun on her heel, and stormed back into her house. It was the sweetest satisfaction I had ever felt.